Hey all, welcome back to You're Listening to Radio Revel. This is the final installment of the story When Herb Met Mable, from the collection called 3. Hope you enjoy it. Mable spent some 40 years trying to get the recipe for that cake out of Susie. Herb was crazy about Susie's chocolate cake, and as both Mable and Herb had shared that cake on the day they met, Mable always attributed it secret powers. It had helped him to smile at that disaster in their first house-building experience. That chocolate cake accompanied them in most of their more important decisions. Finding Susie adamant about keeping the recipe secret, Mable began experimenting on her own, first trying every chocolate cake recipe she could get her hands on, then altering recipes for strawberry cake, lemon cake, spice cake, angel food cake. Many of the experiments were disasters that ended up on the mulch pile before the odor of baked chocolate had totally dissipated from the kitchen. Others Herb appreciated and actually enjoyed, but, to be honest, were not Susie's. Mable explained what she felt about the cake to Herb with the familiar old story about the king becoming lost in the woods on a hunting expedition and wandering for days without finding his way. He finally came upon a small house in which he found a very old man stirring a delicious-smelling stew in a huge black cauldron above the burning embers in the fireplace. Having not eaten for now several days, the king asked if the old man might share some of his soup. The king found himself in front of a bowl of the savouriest broth he had ever eaten. He begged the old man for the recipe, but the old man refused to hand it over, and the king began to suspect that the old man was a sorcerer, and not having had much luck in his past dealings with such, hurriedly left, promising to recompense the old man upon his return to the castle, which, fed by the mysterious soup, the king found in only hours. The king sent his men out to find the old man to bring him to the castle to be put to work in the kitchen making this marvelous stew. For many days the king ate the soup for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but was not satisfied. Now the soup was different, blander, less tasty. The king called the old man to his throne room and cautiously asked him why he had changed his recipe when it had been perfect before. "I have changed nothing," replied the very old man. "But it's not the same soup. Surely you have overlooked some ingredient." "Your Highness has perceived well. There is an essential ingredient that I cannot add." "What might it be? I'll send my men to the ends of the earth to find it and bring it back to you." "They need not travel so far, for it is found here in your kingdom." "Then show it to me. Tell me what it is, and you shall have it." "The ingredient is simple enough, but only found after much waiting." "What is it then? Speak, once and for all." "It is your Highness's hunger." Mable began to take her cakes to Susie for her opinion. Over the years the two women had developed a close, sometimes mother-daughter-like friendship. They adopted one another and happily ignored the oncoming years and their threats of old age and death. One Saturday, after baking all morning, Mable placed a wedge of her latest experiment in an airtight, triangular Tupperware slice of cake container and headed out to Susie's for a cup of coffee and a chat. On these occasions, Mable always ate a piece of Susie's cake, contrasting the taste with a bite or two of her own. Susie would only eat Mabel's cake, then make one elusive, ambiguous comment. "You've improved on the sugar since your father passed on." It was true. H had been rabid on the use of sugar in the house, demanding that all his food, from breakfast oatmeal to grease gravy, be enhanced with sugar. Mable herself was no enemy to sugar, but she could not interpret Susie's comment as meaning that she was now using less, because she actually used less during the last years of her father's life, in part because of doctor's orders, and in part because of her constant, subtle rebellion against H's constant, aggressive, abrasive, abusive attitude. They both, Susie and Mable, pushed their plates away after squishing the final few crumbs with their forks to leave nothing behind. Usually Susie would change the subject immediately. These days she nearly always asked after Pierce, who had been living in Europe now for what seemed to be his entire life, having only returned when he sensed correctly that his grandfather was about to die. This day, however, something kept her mind on the cake, and she mentioned to Mabel that she felt that she was getting old. Now at 77 years, she was afraid the world would not be able to get on if the recipe were not handed down to someone. I don't have anything that looks like a will, but do have a small box with my jewelry and a few papers. In a small pink envelope is a table check with the recipe scribbled out. I did that one day when I had discovered that I had forgotten how old I was. I figured that if I couldn't remember my age, I would soon be forgetting the recipe. I have no family now, and I'd like you to have that envelope when I die. Of course, Mabel chided Susie, telling her that she was unlikely to die. Her mother had lived past 80, her grandmother well past 90, but this did no good, because that night, after finding the envelope in her jewel box and writing Mabel's name on the flap and licking it to seal, Susie crawled into her bed, wrapped her arm around the old gray tomcat that had kept her company in the long years after her mother and grandmother had died, and closing her eyes, drifted into a peaceful death herself. Mabel's death was not so peaceful, neither for her nor for Herb. It was Labor Day weekend, a holiday that had lost its significance for Herb since he had finally been forced to retire. The two of them had survived well on his pension and now ran a small lawn-cutting, garden-weeding business that helped them make ends meet. Herb could always find a bit of extra work, helping put in a kitchen or tear out a wall to make the living room longer. This weekend, though, came in the middle of a couple of weeks of just sitting around the house, staring at the television, reading westerns. Herb had thrown his back hanging a door, and Mabel had been suffering from a constant head cold that she couldn't seem to shake off. Their mutual discomfort made them realize that at 66 and 70 years of age, they were truly becoming old people. They had never been grandparents. Pierce never did get married, and their active lives lied to them even when their aching bones and muscles were screaming, or just moaning, the accounts of their accumulated years. And these 2 weeks had been cold and rainy, no chance to mow or weed. They lay in bed every morning until 11, late breakfast, late lunch, late dinner, late dessert, late show on the tube, late to bed, late to rise. They both realized at the last minute that they were both depressed. Sunday morning, however, Herb awoke from a confused dream in which he had had to kill some huge orange monster that resembled a basketball with arms and legs and a grinning mouth. The bullet Herb shot at the monster merely stuck in its seeping flesh, and when Herb ran at it with an axe intending to chop at it, the creature grabbed him and squeezed him into wakefulness. The hour was early, the sun was shining, the air dry. He woke Mabel and told her to get out of bed. They were going on a picnic. Mabel must have known the weather would improve, as she had spent several hours Saturday night in the kitchen. While defrosting the fridge, she had made a potato salad, oatmeal cookies, ham salad, mostly picnic things. She had only to dig out the old picnic basket from the utility room from under a bag of old rags, a pile of old ladies' magazines, and a stack of clay flower pots. It had been, indeed, a long time since they had been on a picnic, some 12 years earlier, when Pierce had been for his last visit to the States from Europe. That had been a difficult day. They had decided to drive up to the state park on Saturday, Herb, Mabel, and Pierce, but they couldn't just leave H at home alone, and he had been a terror during the first days of his grandson's visit. "Who the hell is this one now? Another one of your goddamn charity cases, Mabel? What's that worthless husband of yours got to say about this one now? You picking them up younger? Your old man not doing it for you in the bed now?" "Dad, this is your grandson. Don't you remember him?" But of course the old man did not remember his grandson. The boy had been away from home for too many years, and not ever having seen him left H no clear image of ever having had a grandson. Pierce had returned to the States specifically to see and speak with his grandfather. Before leaving, before even thinking about leaving Zurich to revisit a life he had chosen to leave well behind him, he had had a dream that had awakened him sweating. He was driving to work on the coast highway in Spain, trying to recall the last digit of the factory phone number where he gave classes. He wanted to put it in an electronic agenda on the dashboard of his car. He had the first 6 numbers entered, and they glowed at him in defiant green, defying him to remember if the last number were a 1 or a 4. Looking ahead on the highway, he noticed a thick black fog enclosing a small resort town he had to pass through, and felt that nervous excitement he had always experienced as a boy when his parents took him to the basement during a tornado warning. Once he had seen an actual tornado rip through the strawberries beside the house, leaving the roof intact but busting all the windows that they had not had time to open before heading to the basement. He parked the car and got out, walking among people on the boardwalk, everyone commenting on how the black fog was dangerous. No one should enter it. He wanted to enter it and heard a voice in his head tell him that the fog was a tear in the fabric of time. As he passed the first wisps going towards the darkest center, he awoke, thinking he would have to stop by the travel agency and book a seat on the next possible flight to the States. He telephoned his mother that night and told her of his imminent surprise visit, though he did not tell her of his certainty that his grandfather was going to die. Pierce knew that H had stubbornly reached the crazy old age of 93 by being a pain in the ass to anyone who knew him, knew that communication with the blind old man would be limited to listening to him cuss and bad-mouth and bitch at his daughter. Despite these obstacles, Pierce had to complete a promise he had made to his mother before leaving the country, that he would be there for her when either her father or his father died. He also had to keep the promise he had made to H as a boy. They were sitting on the front porch, H in his rocker with a pint bottle of whiskey in his hand from which he took long swallows, then passed to Pierce, sitting on the step below, leaning against the railing, who would take a fast sip, hold it in his mouth until the burning sensation had passed, then swallow quickly before his throat had a chance to tighten up. H was getting the boy drunk, was getting drunk himself, because he had felt lucid enough this morning to be able to tell someone what was going on behind the dark glasses that shielded the world from his sightless eye sockets. "Are you listening to me, boy?" "Yes, Grandpa." "You goddamn well better be, because I'm going to tell you something I've never told another living soul, something that might put your hair on end, give you nightmares. You think you can handle a horrific story from a crazy old man?" "Sure, Grandpa. Mama lets me stay up Friday nights to watch the creature features, and they don't scare me at all."
"That shit's nothing, boy. And don't keep calling me Grandpa. I hate it. My name is H."
"But H isn't a name."
"It sure as hell is. What was Jesus' middle name?"
"I don't know. Did he have one?"
"Jesus H. Christ. That's what he was called, and I'm named right after our Lord and Savior."
Here H took another slug at the bottle to calm the hysterical laughing fit this joke had brought on. Had he had eyes, tears would have rolled from them. In any case, he didn't want Mable coming out to investigate, in part because he knew he'd get a chewing out for drinking, for getting the boy drunk, and for being her father. He had to get this story out now or take it with him to the grave.
"Now listen, boy. You know what I did for a living before I got stupid enough to put out my own eyes?" "No. Fixing other people's automobiles, that was my hobby. And you couldn't know, 'cause I never told anybody. I couldn't tell, and you'll see why. Take another hit off the bottle. You're going to need it." "One summer, when I was just a little older than you are now, I started going on adventures in some of the caves on my daddy's land. They were mostly just spaces between huge stones that some glacier had dumped when the sun got hot a few million years ago, but one time I happened upon a treasure. I found an old Indian burial site. There weren't many leavings, only 2 or 3 bodies, mostly bones, wrapped in mostly wasted animal hides. That wasn't the treasure. The treasure was a clay pot with a lid. Inside I found stones and metals that I was sure were emeralds and gold. They weren't anything more than turquoise and copper, but that discovery gave me a passion, and I began planning on how to make myself rich. I thought, hell, these Indians are dead, and no one even remembers their names, and here's all these jewels and stuff. Not very valuable, true, but there's lots of dead people who get buried with rings and watches and gold teeth. Sentimental shit like that seemed to me a waste. So I became a grave robber."
"You mean like in Frankenstein?"
"Don't know. Never saw the picture. In any case, I didn't start right off digging up graves. I was too young, and besides, I decided I needed some kind of plan. I went to the public library almost every day that spring, walked into town. My folks thought I was getting smart. Maybe I was. but the only thing I ever looked at were books about dead people. H explained to the increasingly drunk boy how he had researched into the deaths of important people in the area. He began with old newspapers and population listings, reading obituaries and property transfers. His first found treasure was the cemetery registry. This book listed all the local cemeteries and their occupants up to about 10 years before he had been born. Careful comparison between sources led him to a cemetery in the neighboring county where he asked the caretaker for summer work, cutting grass, removing dead flowers, raking leaves. What appeared careful attention to the preservation of the stones was actually careful attention to who was buried in each plot. H kept a small notebook in his hind pocket, in which he mapped out the positions of all the wealthier members of the community who had left their remains to rot 6 feet under. He returned to school in the fall, but left school at the middle of the term because he heard that that same caretaker had died. He asked for the position and was granted it. H did not tell his folks that he was working in a bone orchard. He did not think that they would approve, and he did not want them suspecting what his plans for his future might be. He made up a story about a chicken farm in the next county, and because his parents didn't pay much attention to him anyway, they simply thought that it was best that the boy have a job. Too much study only rotted the brain, and they thought that this boy's brain was rotten enough. A job would keep him out of trouble anyway. Despite his intentions, H did manage to keep out of trouble. He had learned young that to play at being dumb left him free from suspicion as he developed his own particular scheming way of acting out his plans. He did not begin digging up those graves he had carefully marked with a diamond in his tattered notebook as he worked the midnight shift. Instead, he cared for the grounds and waited patiently for the locals to begin respecting him. It was actually less their respect that he wanted than their indifference. The time he spent with the previous caretaker had helped him see that the gravedigger is not a loved person, not hated, simply ignored until someone had to be planted. H did his share of plantings, always respectfully going to the visitations and sharing his sympathy with the survivors, always taking a quick peek in the box at the funeral parlor, mentally noting rings and watches and gold eyeglasses, cufflinks and earrings and necklaces left to the dead to take into their next life, mostly because the living could not bear to keep these trinkets that reminded them of their lost loved one. He noted these items later in his notebook. When he turned 18, H looked old enough and respectable enough to begin putting his grander plan into action. Like many cemeteries, this one had started out as a plot of ground on the outside of town. People were buried helter-skelter without organization. After a little over a century of dead bodies, the place was getting crowded. The town hall was looking for solutions. In the old days, someone would have donated another piece of land, but values were up and the budget would not pay for a new 10 acres for the area's future corpses. H went to the council with a reorganization plan he had conceived in which older tombs would be dug up, moved to the remaining free corner with their headstone, and the old area would be laid out in rows to take better advantage of the space. Not wanting too many details beyond the notes H presented them with, the powers that be agreed to his suggestion, and he implemented it at once. In his summer with the old caretaker, he had had to help move a grave so that the long-dead great-great-grandfather could lie at rest in the recently spruced-up family plot. H dug and was at least 7 feet down when he realized that he had dug right on through great-granddad's remains. H had several dozen wooden boxes made up, 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot, painted black and lined with tin. He knew that the remains of those he intended on moving would fit nicely into his new boxes, shoveled in after being sifted through for their treasures. He worked alone for a year, finishing the reorganization, leaving tight, neat rows in the northeast corner and space in the remainder of the cemetery for at least another 50 years' worth of death. Those who had shunned the responsibility of a new cemetery had now left it to their survivors. H's wealth, of course, did not increase because of his work as caretaker. The pay was miserable and the hours worse. He instead bought himself a small suitcase that he slowly filled with the things he found in his treasure hunts. When it was filled, he took a weekend trip to the city and went from antique dealer to antique dealer until he found one corrupt enough to buy the jewels for their artistic worth. Some things he sold at weight, gold from teeth, silver, chains, and the like. He returned to the cemetery with the money and buried it behind the shack where his tools were kept. When he married, he banked the money and stopped his work in that particular cemetery. He worked on cars and traveled as a consultant to other cemeteries in the area where overcrowding had left them in a dilemma. He was able to visit his friend in the city off and on for several years, always returning home with paper in exchange for stones and metal. When H had finished explaining this to Pierce, the old man dug into his pocket and pulled out a battered, stained, and torn notebook. He pressed it into the boy's hands and said, "I want you to promise me, boy, that you will keep this notebook hidden from everyone you know. It is the proof of a crime against nature. That don't mean I regret what I did. I do worry, though, that the same could happen to me. In fact, I'm certain that I'll end up getting my comeuppance for what I did. I want you to promise me, boy, that the day that I die, and you will know that day, I'll call you on that day, and no matter where you are, you will hear my call, that you will return here and see to it that I am not buried. I want to be burned, and I want my worthless ashes spread over the grass of that first cemetery that I slandered." Pierce had insisted that they bring H along on the picnic to the state park. Pierce was the only one who knew that the old man was going to die in a couple of days, and though his arrival from Europe had brought on a fit of bad behavior on H's part, the old man had calmed considerably after Pierce had taken him aside the night before, after dinner. Neither Herb nor Mable knew what Pierce had said to his grandfather, but they were grateful for the results. "Listen, Granddad, I know you're crazy as a coon, but I also know that you made yourself that way. And just like we both know why I suddenly showed up in these parts, and we both know that I have a promise to keep." Pierce removed from his pocket the notebook and pressed it into H's hands. "This is the promise that I will keep. But you must make a promise to me now. And if you can't keep this promise, then I can't keep mine. I want you to be good for whatever time is left to you. It's not much, and it might kill you, but you must be civil to my father, and more, kind to my mother. They have suffered years of your abuse, and though before I was only a boy and couldn't say anything, I'm a man now, and either you'll do as I ask, or I'll have you buried and dug up, and buried and dug up, again and again and again, until your soul screams to be left in peace. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "Will you do that for me?" "Yes." It did kill the old man to be nice. For 2 days he did not spit his food on his daughter's clothing. For 2 days he tried to say good morning at the breakfast table to his son-in-law. The day of the picnic he sat quietly in the back of the car, then sat quietly in his wheelchair, unnerving Mable into asking him, "Daddy, haven't you anything to say?" H didn't reply at once. He cocked his head, seemed to be listening to the wind in the tall pine trees around the picnic area. He munched deliberately on the potato salad left in his mouth, swallowed hard, and replied, "This park must be beautiful. Too bad I can't see it." Mable could not bring herself to continue the conversation. The next day the effort was showing. H's face was red, and he seemed to cringe under the observant eye of Pierce. He said he was not hungry at dinner time and asked if they mightn't put him to bed. Late in the night he called out to Pierce, who came quietly, not wanting to wake his parents. Pierce sat up with the old man all through the late night into the morning, and before his mother and father rose, he had called the funeral parlor and arranged for the cremation. As Mable removed the picnic things from the basket, she was surprised to find a small, old-fashioned notebook like she had used in her school days. Opening it, she immediately recognized her father's handwriting, but could not make head nor tail of what the drawings and lists of names and items could mean. The notebook distracted her so that when she took the food from the fridge to put it in the basket, she actually did not notice that it was not chilled. She did not bother to mention the notebook to Herb. They had not spoken about H since his death. She didn't miss her father, and Herb's attitude goes without saying. They arrived at the state park and by chance chose the same picnic area as they had years earlier. They laid out the table together and then took a short walk to the brook that ran behind the pine tree shelter of the area. They sat side by side on a wooden bench and talked mentally about their life together. They spoke out loud about going to Europe to visit Pierce. They talked mentally about their individual fears about death. They spoke out loud about maybe selling the house and moving down south where the weather would be easier on their old bones. Mentally, they told each other of their enduring love. Out loud, they kissed and went to have lunch. Herb was a little queasy from the drive. The curvy roads always left him a little carsick, and with the echoes of pain from his accident, he didn't have much appetite. He only ate a little of the potato salad, which didn't matter to Mable. Her philosophy had always been, fine, that's more for me. She ate 2 generous helpings. On the drive home, she began to complain that she was feeling a little queasy herself and wondered if they had both gotten some bug or flu. An hour after arriving home, Mable was complaining about bad cramps. As Herb drove her to the hospital an hour later, he was surprised at how, in her delirium, she sounded just like her father. She was complaining that she couldn't see. An hour later, while he waited for the effects of the stomach pumping they had put him through to pass, he wondered what he would do now with his life, without his beautiful wife. 5 years later, Herb had not yet gotten over his dislike for flying, and so missed the funeral of his only son. A month later, he received the urn containing Pierce's ashes, and following his son's wishes, spread them over the strawberry beds of their first house. 9 years later, Herb rested peacefully at the right side of his wife, under a stone that simply said, Herb met Mable in 1954.
You're listening to Radio Revel. Listen, like, subscribe, and share.